So welcome to How to Sell Drugs, the podcast about drug culture, policy, and business with an emphasis on harm reduction. Our podcast is produced by Lucy Goods. If you or someone you know is a smoker, we encourage you to try our wide-ranging line of delicious and satisfying nicotine products at lucy.co. So today we have a wonderful guest lined up, Brett McCully, who is getting his Ph.D. in economics and has been doing some research into the economics of drugs. So we thought we'd have him on to discuss some of his research and some of the economic research into drugs in the field. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
And as always, we're joined by my co-host, David Rintel. Hi, David.
Hey, how's it going, John?
Cool. So let's start with a little bit about yourself. So you're at UCLA. How did you kind of get there? Can you take us through your path to get into this PhD program?
Yeah, so I was kind of always interested in economics. My dad was actually an economist, and I really liked debating policy and politics. And I always felt like economics was one of the harder kind of phenomena to understand. So I'm like, well, maybe I should take classes in it since it's so hard. And so I took classes in undergrad at the University of Virginia. Kept finding things interesting, started doing some research stuff. Eventually started working at the Federal Reserve Board for a couple of years, and then applied to PhD programs and got into UCLA's.
Got it. What's the biggest economic debate that you have going with your dad?
Oh, that's a good question. I feel like we agree on a lot of fiscal and monetary policy things,
okay.
But we might disagree on what to do about drug policy.
Oh, really? Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
It's got to be crypto. That's the biggest economic rift between the olds and the youngs.
Sure. Yeah. What's your crypto take?
I have no idea. I went to like a lecture by Martin Feldstein, who's like this famous Harvard economist,
Yeah.
and a young person asked him in the audience, like, what do you think about cryptocurrency? And he's just like, I hope it disappears. He hates it. So.
Yeah, Paul Krugman,
totally
same
right.
thing.
Yeah.
Famously debated someone from Andreessen Horowitz and took a very
Really?
hardline stance against it, but remains to be seen if he'll be right. So I think we know a little bit about what got you interested in economics. When you talk about macro and micro, which one would you say you focus on most?
I'd say I'm more of a microeconomist with a focus on empirical methods.
Okay. And then you mentioned earlier that you were focused on kind of international economics. Can you talk a little bit about that and some of the research that you've done in the past?
Yeah, so international economics is just considering the economics of when things move across borders or move across space. So whether that's people or capital or goods. And so I've looked at questions related to trade and migration because it's obviously a really important public policy.
Sure. So when one of those kind of seminal papers comes out, how do you see it kind of working its way through from the halls of academia into the real world?
Yeah, I guess I don't see it. There's no direct line in general. So for like very carefully, very like narrow changes, sort of tweaks, where a policymaker can be like, press this button and like now I'm going to automatically enroll people in 401ks, for example, or
Sure.
increase that. Like they can do that. But if it's like, you're researching something on like how our migration policy should change, that kind of fuels in like a civil society debate. And they cite this evidence, which then might be used to change policy. But yeah, I don't have I don't think policymakers or a senator read an economics paper and they're like, oh, gee whiz, I should change my policy views. Like,
it's kind of a long tail. It takes a while for this to actually work its way into the public and into the discourse, and then eventually, I guess the public needs to be putting pressure on its policymakers to really adopt the kind of the latest and greatest economic research, really.
Right, and the economists provide some of the evidence for that.
Yeah, and it also needs to probably be boiled down to a soundbite, because if it's not something that can be put on a poster, most politicians aren't really going to run with it. If it's too difficult to understand, they're probably going to have trouble pitching it to the American public.
Is there a good example of economists producing some kind of work that swayed policy, that just like went straight from academia into government? Is there like a seminal example?
I mean, it's a long transition between like publishing a paper and getting the policy actually implemented. But like for matching markets, so New York City matches students to charter schools, and that was done using a system developed, I think, in the 1960s or 70s by some Nobel Prize winning economists who worked on that exact problem.
Interesting. So now you're kind of starting to research the economics of drugs. What kind of spurred your interest in that specifically?
So I think my research question is kind of along the lines of, we've had globalization happening for the last few decades, or the second round of globalization. Are there kind of unanticipated consequences of globalization in terms of if globalization happens for legal goods and for immigration, is it also happening for illegal markets like drugs? And that's a kind of a margin that hasn't been looked at by economists that I'm really aware of. And so that answering that question in a rigorous way was really what interested me in the area.
So practically speaking, does that mean, like, let's just use like the United States-Mexico border. Mm-hmm. So if an increase in globalization is happening, it means we're sending them more stuff, they're sending us more stuff. So the border is more active, and it's easier for people trying to import or export drugs across the border to hide their wares in a pre-existing shipment or under the guise of like a fake company. And so
exactly.
That would be the relationship that you're looking for. Do you see an outsized proportion of drug imports? Do you see drug imports increasing as globalization increases? Is that fundamentally what you're saying?
Yeah, so we've seen that there's been for quite a while, at least for a few decades in the 80s and 90s and part of the 2000s, a decline in the price of illegal drugs, which was associated with an increase in trade and globalization, in the world economy. And the idea is just as you said, it's sort of like the needle in the haystack. If the haystack of legal trade keeps growing, then finding that needle of illegal drugs in there can become harder and harder. And one of the sort of anecdotal examples that's kind of interesting is in the most recent El Chapo trial, right? Like he would stick cocaine or marijuana in, I think it was like tomato sauce cans or something, and ship it on a train. It was all, had legal invoices and it looked like legal trade, go up to Chicago where they'd unpack it and then distribute it into the United States. And those type of examples are fairly common.
And so it sounds like you're saying that economists would use the price of drugs as a data point for whether there are more or less of them because of the supply and demand curve. So if there are more drugs in the country, the price is lower because it's easier to get them, and so people have to charge lower prices. I've heard also that law enforcement uses a metric. They assume that they catch some percentage of the illegal drugs, and so then they can look at what the size of the shipment is. And so are those the two main data points? Would you say the main data point as an economist is the price, or are there other factors?
Yeah, I mean, certainly fundamental to any model of supply and demand, you want to have data on prices and quantities. So you kind of look at seizures, like you said, what law enforcement seizes. You assume that that's proportional to what the actual trade flows are, and then you observe prices, which is like the DEA collects data, for example, on drug busts, where they'll have an undercover informant who will actually get will buy some drugs or have drugs bought from them, and they'll record that price and send it to some centralized database.
Is the DEA one of the best sources for economic data about drugs, or do you look to the UN? Are there other what are the most popular sources to analyze? Yeah,
so it's going to depend on the particular question. So if you want to ask about a question about drug abuse, drug use, and consumption, then you're going to go to like the National Institutes of Health or CDC. I think they have some databases on drug use. But if you want something on prices, then you would probably use the DEA database, where it is just built off of this database based on drug seizures or drug busts and informants.
You can't just poll the students in your intro to econ class at UCLA.
I know.
That's a pretty large student body who's probably some percentage are consuming drugs.
That's true. That's true. But they might be buying whatever the UCLA drugs are.
Well, why don't you then allow them to anonymously submit them for testing, so then you can test the purity and then you can back your way out into the pure price.
I somehow don't think that they're in deep with the El Chapo tomato shipments in Chicago at that level.
Well, those are different things. Oh, you're saying the price per kilo? I mean, I assume you would collect prices all throughout the supply chain.
Yeah. So the prices increase per kilo like dramatically when you go from like wholesale to retail market.
Got it.
And so they have like for major drug busts, they do have some data on those, and that's kind of the wholesale price for large amounts. And there's, but then once it's at the retail level, at the street level, prices go up by a huge amount. And that's true throughout the supply chain. Like the farm gate price for coca leaf is like so much lower for opium. It's like these poor farmers in Afghanistan who are growing opium are getting, $1,000 or something for the amount of heroin that's going to be produced from that's going to sell for like $150,000 in the U.S.
Wow. You said farm gate. What does that mean exactly?
Right. So that's just you have farmers who are growing coca leaf or opium poppies, which are the raw materials for cocaine and heroin, respectively. And those are grown by farmers, and they sell it to some person who's going to take that and process it. And so it's the price paid by that person to the farmer.
Oh, got it. Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
How does that compare to other commodities that are not drugs in terms of the farm gate prices to ultimate product?
I don't know exactly, but my sense is that it's quite a bit more of a multiplier.
You just described a 100x multiple, and I doubt that that's the case with something like avocados.
Yeah, because so much of the value added is just like literally getting it from that farm gate to the consumers in the wealthy countries, which is all the trafficking, which takes so much, effort and money and risk.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense.
Do you ever get concerned that you're going to gather this data and then go to your professor and he's going to be like, I've been paying so much more for my drugs than what you've been why didn't you tell me sooner?
Yeah, that's
it's not a widespread problem in academia, I imagine. I do think it's funny that there's obviously a lot of great research done, but it must be fairly far removed from what's actually going on the ground versus the DEA, who's actually like on a drug bust and maybe experiencing.
That's true, but there is one exception that I can think of. So Sudhir Venkatesh was a sociology Ph.D. student at University of Chicago in 1988. He was trying to figure out what he'd do for his dissertation, and he started going to one of the public housing projects nearby, and he befriended this leader of a local drug gang, JT, pseudonym JT.
This was in Freakonomics, right?
This was in Freakonomics.
Yeah, I remember this.
Yeah, exactly. So he befriended this guy, and he saw him just kind of going around like just talking to people and then going to go bowling or do whatever. And he's like, your job isn't that hard. I bet I could do it. And so he's like, all right, well, why don't you try to do it for a day? And so he did actually, he's a drug dealer for a day.
Wow.
But at the end of this, when JT and company were all put in prison, he got data for the gang, which included like all their sales, all their costs, wages for people, all sorts of data that you couldn't imagine getting otherwise. And so that was probably like actually getting one's hands dirty with,
I remember similarly I think it was a podcast or someone did an analysis of just how Somali pirates run their operations, and they have timesheets and all the same accounting measures that you'd expect from any businesses, and it's just funny because from the outside you often think about drug dealers as kind of like devil may care attitude, very rough and tumble, but it is a business and it is often run like a very well-oiled machine. Yeah,
and like also in the El Chapo trial, when I was hearing about like, oh, he hired like the IT guy to set up their networks. I was like, oh right, they have to set up networks too.
Of course, yeah. It is funny to kind of reframe and get in that mindset. You mentioned something about how prices are tracked, and I was wondering, is there anything close to kind of like a consumer price index or inflation metric for drugs that's tracked as kind of a basket of goods as opposed to just a single, because I imagine, as you mentioned, the farm gate price is different than the street price. Like how can economists say, drug prices are decreasing in America? Is there kind of a standard metric, or is it just something that everyone knows is true because because that's just kind of what the data intuitively says?
Yeah, I think it's just based on kind of our best guess based on this incomplete data, because obviously you can't send a Bureau of Labor Statistics person out with a clipboard asking, "Excuse me, sir, how much is your crack cocaine?" You have to you have to use these kind of like how much what are informants getting on the street, what are drug busts netting in terms of price. But yeah, there might be something better out there, but I think it's pretty hard to.
Yeah, I would imagine when they get people to cooperate against the other people in their organization, they work out the economics and they probably submit that data, or it's accessible in some way.
Yeah.
But I also really like the idea. So sometimes in this podcast, we uncover really interesting jobs that nobody would ever knew, or no one would ever know exist as an option. One of the jobs on a previous podcast was NFL drug tester, and they like to bust people when they're on vacation. So these NFL drug testers will be dispatched to random Caribbean islands to surprise the player and say, "Here, submit for a drug test." I like the idea that the DEA is maintaining a network of Confederates throughout the United States who they don't bust, because they want them to continue over a period of time to submit the data on how much they're paying for kilos of drugs. And so you could get a job where your job is to buy cocaine by the kilo on a regular basis in a major metropolitan area. I think you just have to call up the DEA and submit an application, right?
Yeah, I don't know. I think the data construction might be that they get it from local law enforcement. I don't know if they have their own informants on the ground, but
sure,
maybe it's something like that.
Well, we'll have to get someone on from the DEA.
Yeah. So we talked about a couple interesting ways economists gather drugs. Maybe it would be good to go into some of the research that we kind of passed back and forth beforehand. Let's talk about the Mexican drug war. Can you tell me a little bit about that Melissa Dell paper and kind of maybe brief David a little bit on it, and then we can kind of dive into some of that?
Yeah. Well, first some background on the Mexican drug war. So, a lot of drugs, a lot of marijuana and cocaine travels from Colombia to the United States somehow. It used to go through the Caribbean, but the U.S. increased their enforcement to the Caribbean such that a lot of the trafficking moved to Mexico. And eventually in 2006, I think Jose Calderon was elected president on the pro-enforcement, pro-crackdown ticket, and he said, I'm going to end this trafficking and the power of the cartels, and so I'm going to bring in the federal military to crack down on this and try to put an end to the cartels. And so that's what happened. They tried to do that, and it was associated with a huge increase in violence in the country. So a lot of drug murders and so on. So Melissa Dell steps in to try to understand what is the effect of an increase in enforcement on violence in a country. And so obviously if you just look at a place that has a lot of drug violence, and then what was I saying?
So it sounds like you were saying that unexpectedly, you would think that if you're going to enforce policy, that you're going to crack down on cartel leaders, that you're going to result or have results that show fewer drugs, less violence. But in fact, we didn't talk about how drugs were affected, but violence increased. And an analogy that I think we hear or that we see in popular culture is, if you go after the head of a cartel, then it leaves a lot of chaos with the underlings, and each one of them says, well, I should be head of the cartel, and that results in some violence. Is that kind of what you were saying was the results showed?
Yeah, that's some of... So the results effectively showed that if the pro-crackdown party was elected mayor of a municipality, that violence in that particular municipality spiked. And the idea was that when you crack down on the local incumbent that's controlling that territory, now it looks weak to other drug organizations, and they might try to scoop up that territory, which leads to violence and fighting. And then, in addition, she also found that drug trafficking would be routed around the place in which the crackdown was happening, which would thereby increase violence in surrounding municipalities.
So what should you do?
So what should you do? On the other side of the border, there's another study done by a different set of researchers where they looked at the effects of medical marijuana legalization in U.S. states on drug trafficking-related violence. And they found that when a locality legalized medical marijuana, that drug deaths closer to the border, or at least on a route to that locality, would fall. And so these two studies together would kind of suggest that violent crackdowns on drug traffickers is not really the way to reduce violence.
So this sounds like a no-brainer for us in California because we've legalized medical and then subsequently recreational marijuana. But what about cocaine? Should we legalize cocaine?
Well, that is a question. So with marijuana, I think it's a little clear because we don't think the social costs of consumption are very high. We think they're, roughly zero maybe. But for cocaine, I guess I'd have to learn more, or economists would have to learn more about what the social costs are. Because usually we think of if someone becomes addicted to a substance, they're going to commit more crimes in furtherance of that addiction. And you have to take that into account when you're choosing which public policy to do. Nevertheless, that doesn't mean that violent crackdowns is going to be the solution if you want to reduce usage. I think the economist's approach would be what are the costs and benefits of different approaches. So then it's like, okay, what are the costs and benefits of decriminalization versus prohibition versus legalization and taxation? And that's kind of a more complex question to.
So it seems like a lot of these fundamental questions come down to, are you taking a supply side policy or a demand side policy? And at least in the Mexico example, it seemed like trying to cut off the supply was largely ineffective because they spent, I think in the paper it said $9 billion and crime actually increased. So it had, a negative net benefit. Right. So is it fair to say that like economists are kind of advocating for more kind of demand side policies and trying to reduce the demand of illegal drugs, or is it kind of more complicated than that? I imagine that it's, like you said, on a per substance basis, very much so, right?
Right. Yeah, I think that's true. And I think so. I think economists' guiding principle here is not that they're morally opposed to any particular drug. So it's really just the costs and benefits, like you said.
Sure.
And so when we look at supply side interventions like crop eradication, interdiction of drugs across borders.
What was that?
Crop eradication, like trying to defoliate coca leaf or opium poppies.
Okay, so actually destroying the raw materials themselves.
Right. Yeah, so if you try to do that or try to intercept the drugs on their way to their destination, which is the more supply side interventions versus trying to have public health, sort of public relations campaigns to tell people about the dangers of drug use or have specific individual level treatment.
Yeah. Either legalize
programs.
The drug or help people not be so addicted to them.
Right.
So, and give them other options than going and buying increasing amounts, which ultimately fuels the cartel, and the cartel will figure out ways to traffic in different areas or restore their fields. Right. I'd love to go into that crop eradication study because I found that really interesting. So, could you you can probably give a brief summary of exactly what happened in that paper, but
yeah. So basically, they want to understand the effects of crop eradication on cultivation. So
and this is in Colombia.
This is in a Colombian context where they would have planes fly overhead. They douse a field with some defoliant, which would should kill the plant life there. They'd have to sort of prepare the area, and it's a really expensive thing. But there's this nice what we call a natural experiment in economics, where 10 kilometers in from the Ecuadorian border, Colombia and Ecuador agreed that Colombia would not eradicate any plants between 0 and 10 kilometers from the Ecuadorian border.
Sure.
And so you get this nice natural experiment because it's kind of a control group where you're not allowed to have any defoliation, and then a treatment group where you can on the other side of the border. But both sides are pretty similar in terms of their geography and income of residents and so forth.
And their propensity to grow coca leaf?
And their propensity to grow.
Interesting.
Before the
so it's like
change.
The ultimate science experiment, basically.
Exactly. And so then you can ask the question of, well, how effective is this defoliation in reducing cultivation?
Sure.
And so what this group of researchers found was that it's not very effective. You can defoliate about 1 acre or 1 hectare, and then it reduces overall cultivation by 0.02 hectares.
It's like 3%, right?
Yeah.
Something like that, or 2%.
It's a very marginal reduction. And so to reduce the amount of cultivation of coca leaf by 1 acre, it's going to cost you $80,000 for the flyover, for the prep, and so on. And so, it takes more than 1 acre to make a kilogram of cocaine. So when you scale up that figure, making some assumptions about the production process, you get that it costs about over $1 million to prevent a marginal kilogram of cocaine from entering the United States if your chosen method of prevention is eradication.
Wow.
And then, so the authors go on to compare this marginal, this very costly program with other interventions. So if you try to interdict or intercept the drugs before they leave Colombia, that costs about $175,000 for the marginal kilogram.
Got it.
If you try to do some kind of public health intervention, have like maybe a better version of Just Say No, that would cost you like $60,000 per kilogram of reduced consumption.
Got it.
If you try to do a treatment program, then it's about $8,000.
Wow.
So, like you said, it really kind of falls between, like, these supply side interventions are extraordinarily costly, whereas the demand side interventions are much less costly. And
and that makes perfect sense from a business perspective, because if, as David and I run companies, and if one supplier doesn't want to help us make a product, we'll talk to another supplier pretty quickly. This has happened in all of our businesses. But if a customer doesn't want to buy our product, there's nothing we can do.
Right.
And so, it really seems almost intuitive. I do want to dive a little bit more into that, because intuitively, like literally burning the crops seems to be very effective intuitively. It's burned, it's gone, or it's defoliated with a chemical. How does it come back so quickly? Did they explore that at all? Or is the cartel just moving it to different areas? Or
so this is basically part of the whole deviation from an Econ 101 type of model of you attack the supply and then price goes up because there's less quantity.
Oh, got it.
The issue is that in the real world there's a lot of different ways in which producers are going to react to an enforcement action upon them. Mm-hmm. And one of those is, well, first of all, they're going to increase productivity of the non-defoliated cropland. So they're going to put more fertilizer in, they're going to use more intensive labor practices or whatever, because they know that some of this stuff is eradicated, price is going up for me because I'm not eradicated, so that's great. And then also you see a lot of reallocation from, say, parts of Colombia that were intensively defoliated, or just from Colombia to Bolivia and Peru. Got it. Which is kind of the old, squeezing the balloon in the air, just going somewhere else. Yeah, got it. Which happens typically in
economics, just in general.
So I feel like you're saying something maybe without really saying it, because you are saying that supply side interventions are too expensive, demand side interventions are best, and demand side interventions typically work when things are legalized and decriminalized. So in essence, you are saying that you think cocaine should be legal.
Well, I guess I'm undecided about decriminalization versus legalization. I would have to, I'm not a health person, so I need to understand more about sort of the health externalities and the crime externalities and addictiveness of it. But I think, to me, decriminalization is perfectly reasonable.
So what does that mean, decriminalization?
So decriminalization, if we consider a real life example, would be Portugal, where someone can face administrative consequences for drug possession, small amounts for personal use. But
what is an administrative consequence?
So that means that you might be put in front of a board of like a couple social workers and a lawyer, and they're gonna tell you need to go to a treatment program or some other kind of intervention. Otherwise, we're gonna fine you. But there's no jail sentence for use or possession of small amounts of illegal drugs.
Got it.
But there is still...
so rehab or a large fine, you choose.
And that's for all drugs in Portugal, correct? Pretty much.
As far as I know, yeah.
Okay. And so that would be the model of decriminalization that you would be referring to.
Yeah. And then there's also, of course, like the Dutch model where I don't think it's necessarily all drugs are legalized, but some drugs are legalized and taxed. And I think that's a perfectly reasonable model for something like marijuana, and it might be reasonable for other drugs. I just, we need to...
There is some economic data on cocaine and heroin when they were illegal at the beginning of the century. I wonder, have those data sets been revisited recently, or is the quality of the data just not good enough, or things are so antiquated because we're just in such a different place? I mean, what do those data sets tell us, if anything? Are they used?
I think that they should be used more because they are super interesting. There's one study back in 1995 which looked at the legal colonial monopoly that the Dutch had in Dutch East Indies, or now present-day Indonesia. And there they kind of estimated some elasticities or sort of responsiveness of drug use to changes in prices that we're interested in as economists. But I think there definitely a lot more could be done with those data. The issue is that they're historical, they're kept probably in some deep, dark basement, and it's hard to get at. But yeah, I think that they absolutely should be utilized more.
Wow, so it really just hasn't been digitized yet, and that's part of the problem? Yeah,
and this is something that in a different field from mine, economic historians do all the time. They go into some basement of archives and they get 10,000 sheets of paper they photocopy or whatever and have some hapless RA digitize it, put it into a database. But
the problem is you come out of that basement and you say, cocaine should be legal. And they're like, he's been spending way too much time in that basement. And we're not saying that cocaine should be legal. We're just having a theoretical discussion. Well, I'm not. You are saying it should be legal, which is fine because you're an economist and a scientist. It's fine.
That's funny. Do you have a favorite movie about drugs?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, favorite TV show is pretty obvious. Is The Wire.
The Wire is great.
I mean, I wish we had data like from season 4 when they did the Amsterdam experiment.
Oh yeah,
where they centralized all the illegal drug trade into one corner or a few corners of the city. Because then you could actually see what happens when there's a sort of a frictionless market for drugs.
Yeah.
They have that in where is that? Denmark.
Yeah.
In Copenhagen, there's a particular area of the city where they allow cannabis sales.
Oh.
But I think I interrupted. You were about to say something.
No. Just that Amsterdam experiment in The Wire, is that based on reality?
Not that I know of.
Okay. Yeah,
but I
it
think
would be
it's
cool
a nice
if it
idea.
was, because we could. I was thinking about Sicario a lot when we were talking about kind of the Mexican drug war. One of the things that is touched on in the paper is that when you kind of like cut off the head of one cartel, it creates just a lot more infighting between all the others. And
that's right.
I think the message of Sicario, or kind of, was just that in many cases the CIA wants a single cartel that they can understand and control, as opposed to chaos, which they have trouble kind of controlling.
Yeah, well, I mean, and looking at Japan, you essentially have seen that model emerge, right? The Yakuza are highly organized, and they're recognized by the government. They have offices, and they communicate with the government. And I think over time now they're losing their stature in society, and they're potentially being attacked and phased out. But that's, I mean, essentially what you're saying is the government decided there are going to be a certain number of black market things in economies. We'd rather have them be organized and be able to have dialogue with the people in charge of them.
And be more or less unchallengeable.
Right.
Because if they can be challenged, then that's where the fighting starts.
Right.
Which is fascinating. Yeah, I never. Now that I'm thinking about it, the message of Sicario is very kind of like, it's sad that the world is this way, but when you look at the kind of the economics of the situation, it's much more rational than the movie kind of makes it out to be, I guess. I don't know.
Who's the actor that plays the Sicario?
Isn't that Benicio del Toro?
Yeah, I thought the message of the movie was don't mess with Benicio del Toro.
Yeah, that's pretty much it too.
What is the plot of this movie?
I don't know. Can you summarize it a little?
Yeah, it's essentially, well, I mean, the first one and the second one are different, but the first one was essentially they're deliberately trying to
Spoiler alert, by the way.
Spoiler alert. The U.S. government is basically trying to crown one cartel as the head cartel and destroy the other ones so that they can have organization, and they think it'll lead to less bloodshed. Basically the opposite of the experiment that you detailed earlier. Instead of attacking many different ones kind of based on opportunity, they just decided to anoint one as the head cartel.
I see.
Yeah.
Well, I think some of that is somewhat from real life. Like, I think some of the stuff that we learned from the El Chapo trial was about the DEA using information from El Chapo's organization somehow to take out some of their rivals.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah, and I mean, it makes sense when you look at the data. It does seem like if you have to choose between one organized cartel and many messy smaller organizations, the bloodshed can be a lot less if you have one organized cartel. Although that is, it's maybe not palatable from a public policy perspective to say I'm going to let this ride.
It doesn't necessarily also have to be one monopolist cartel. It could just be that you don't take out the heads of cartels, because there's some research showing, as long as you have some stable set of cartels with a stable set of leaders, they make pacts and kind of maintain the peace. But when you continually knock out the leadership, then the peace crumbles and violence increases.
Interesting. Yeah, that makes sense.
So it sounds like this makes perfect sense for drugs. What about other black markets? Do you think are you essentially for the decriminalization of most black markets? How do you draw that line?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think along with most economists, would again go back to what are the relative costs and benefits, what are the sort of social externalities for society for consumption of the different goods. So when you think of like prostitution, I feel like there's no reason to me that it shouldn't be even legalized, just because the working conditions for the prostitutes would be significantly improved, and that's worthwhile for that particular market. In terms of guns, I mean, there's a lot of sort of spillovers in terms of people dying from the guns, so I think that's a little harder, but I'm not super familiar with
or in an even more extreme example, like nuclear weapons. The black market for that, certainly has potentially severe social consequences or I guess externalities, really.
Right. Yeah, so I think it all depends on what the specific item is. But, for drugs, it seems like, at the very least, decriminalization makes sense.
Interesting. Well, this is great. Do you have anything else, David?
No, I think we've covered it. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, this was a great conversation. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me on.
Thanks, guys.